Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
podcast for parents and families everywhere.
Whether you have kids that plan to attend college or you have current college students, you want them in and you want them to graduate.
And you want a quality education that is a good value for your money. I am Mark Stucker.
And I am Anika Madden. It is Thursday, September 20th, and welcome to episode number 34. There is hope for the C student. In the news, college applicants reflect on lessons learned and share some much needed advice. And we'll be in chapter 34 of 171 answers. And the chapter is entitled, What Hope Is There for Me If I'm Only a C Student? And this week's question is from a student who wants to know if there are any advantages to applying to college through early action or early decision. And this week, Mark interviews Mr. Mike Runowitz. He is the director of financial aid at Washington University in St. Louis, and they are talking about the common mistakes that families make on the Fafsa application. Listen up. Y'all know Fafsa application opens up on October 1st.
Friends, Anika and I talk or text on most days, but she went like radioactive silent on me for like 6 or 8 days. And for our first-time listeners, Anika's in the Greensboro, North Carolina area, and I'm in Metro Atlanta. So, Anika, I was really concerned that Hurricane Maria had got you. Either lost your power or got flooding. And any updates on the storm? Did it impact you?
Wait, first, I don't think it's Hurricane Maria.
Oh, you know what? That's Puerto Rico. I'm thinking about
the
Puerto
current
Rico.
hurricane.
Florence?
Now that you, yes.
Okay.
Mrs. Florence, and seriously, we were fortunate because we had not been affected by Florence. But the reason why I had the dead silence is because everyone, it's preparation. Everybody's panicking and all for good reason. I won't say it's one of those instances where the weatherman got it wrong, because there are areas really close to us that have been drowning. Like they're flooded to no end. And we just keep those folks in our prayers who have been affected tragically. And I know that there have been actually quite a few deaths in North Carolina. So yeah, we are in the fortunate ones in the area, but yeah, it's been crazy.
And let's keep the Hurricane Maria folks in Puerto Rico in our prayers too. Let's turn to college hot topics in the news.
All right, Mark, the article this week is coming from Mr. Brennan Bernard, and it is about college applicants reflecting on the lessons learned. And so, Mark, what he's done, once again, another fine job. So we know, the kids are getting ready for these applications, and, high school is ramping up. What he says, the treadmill spins faster and faster. And students, they lose sight of, the lessons that they've learned over the few years that they can actually start to apply to themselves or reflect for themselves going into the college admissions process and throughout. It's not just about the college, filling out the application, but getting through college, the first job interview, all that good stuff. So basically what he's done, Mark, is that he rounded up a group of high school seniors and he asked them to hop off the treadmill for a second and just take some time and breathe and tell me about some of the great lessons that you learned or that you feel like you've acquired over time. And there were actually quite a few great ones. But before we do that, Mark, let me just say this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking what Mr. Bernard is saying is that, as students, as they're molding themselves in their high school years in preparation for college, they should know that there are several life lessons to be learned, believe it or not, regardless of what your situation is. That you can apply through the college process. And I know, Mark, reflection and students don't always go hand in hand in the same sentence necessarily. So is it more so a charge to parents to really take the time to get their students to stop and reflect and think about all the things that they can apply to, as young adults moving forward? What do you think?
So I think there's a few things because, and just for our listeners, so Brennan is a director of college counseling at the Derryfield School, which is in New Hampshire. We were colleagues together at the Westtown School in the early 15, 18 years ago now. But he does this exercise where he asks his students to reflect. And so, he wants students to go through this process too. And I think that's fantastic, because at the end of the article, he says, try writing a letter to yourself. Reflecting on your own advice. So I think it could be student could do it to students, or it's a good suggestion for parents to do to students. And for those who are listening, if that sounds really theoretical, Anika and I are about to share some of the insights the students had and talk about profound. You know, it reminds me, Anika, in the Bible, in Psalm 8, verse 2, where it says, you know, God has ordained strength out of the mouth of babes. Like, you know, like anyone who thinks like a teenager doesn't have some profound wisdom and insights and sagacious thoughts, like listen to some of these things that these students came up with, because Solomon himself couldn't come up with better advice than they came up with.
That's right. So let me rattle off a few, Mark.
Yep.
And I'm just going to say, let me see. I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 great ones. So
Okay.
the first one for me is unplug more often than not. You know, unplugging from the world of social media, taking time to be mindful of yourself. Learn by trial and error. Yeah, cell phone. Of course. Learn by trial and error. Keep working on yourself. Stand up for yourself. Well, I thought that was phenomenal. Talk to people about your problems. I can't, tell you enough, these kids that we run across where they don't talk through what they're feeling, what they're going through. And I'm just going to say one final one, Mark, that I'm always reminding my kids about, and that's to be grateful. Just simply be grateful for the opportunities that you've had and that exist for you moving forward.
Yeah, and when you listen to these, I mean, this sounds like something like your, 90-year-old great grandfather would say, right? Like, in terms of just how prudent these things are. So I wrote down some that jumped off the page for me, and there were so many, so it was really hard. But some of the ones I put down were do you, not anyone else, because I think it's really easy to do that. Live in the present, because you can't do anything about the past. And, the way we should probably relate some of these to college admissions too, right? So when I think of that, I think of the students instead of beating themselves up over, their grades in 9th grade. You can't do anything about that right now. Another one, find the balance. So, we talked a lot about striking balance in your life. Another one I like, don't be so hard on yourself, because I think students are under so much mental anguish right now. And part of it's because they're hard on themselves. Here's one I liked a lot. Don't compare yourself to others, because that happens all the time. And here's a couple more, like, you are not a failure unless you give up. I thought that one was great. And the last one I put down was everything will work out in the end. And if it doesn't, it's not the end. And so, we could have really gone a deep dive on these. We didn't really want to do that. This is more food for thought. We're going to put the article in the show notes. But we would encourage you to look at it, have your students look at it, and have your students go through this exercise, because there's a tendency in this college process for people to think, oh, it's like the end of the world if I don't get in my dream school. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not at all. And so I think if I had to summarize everything, Anika, and I know what your thoughts are, I would say keep everything in perspective.
That's right. Perfectly said. Love it. Now it's time for our step-by-step walkthrough of the college admissions process.
All right, friends, we're in the part of our podcast where we consider this our college admission course. We kind of walk through and answer the most frequently asked questions that I get as a college coach, which I turned into a book called 171 Answers. And that book is kind of the basis for this part of our podcast. And if you ever want to know what we're going to be talking about in the future, you can just go to 171answers.com, and we have every one of our future chapters / segments laid out for you there. And so we're up to number 34. 34. Our episode numbers correspond with the chapters in the book. And this chapter is called What Hope Is There for Me If I Am a C Student? And Anika, why don't you start and share some of your takeaways from this chapter, and then I'll add some commentary.
Well, let's start with the fact that there is hope.
Got that right.
That it actually exists. And, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with parents. Jalen is a very strong student. So it was hard for a lot of parents and, some of the leadership roles I took on for them to be able to relate to me, because they felt like because I had a strong student, it's like, oh, you don't understand. Like, you don't know what I'm going through. You can't, your child is doing X, Y, and Z. So it's just every time I see these, every time I see this laid out, written out the way you've done it, Mark, I appreciate it because I do know that there are so many bright students that are C students. Yes, your student is still bright, especially if they're living up to their potential. And the fact that, and with that hope, there are schools, there are schools that actually take in these students. Like you talk about the schools that, that offer the open enrollment, they accept all students as long as they have the diploma, or that fact that they can go through the college navigator and identify those schools that accept more than 80% of their student applicants. And the best part is there are scholarships available for average students, for C students. And I mean, I've seen a few of these myself, personally. So it's just, I love that this is an opportunity for us to convey. And I know we said this before too, Mark, is that this podcast isn't about the A student, the selective schools and all of that. It's about the college process and your child and how you choose to work through it, and how you find how do you bring out the best for your kid, all kids, regardless of, what the A, B, or C is. So in that regard, I absolutely.
Yeah. And I've got a couple of things. So, one thing I've realized, Anika, is there is this deep-seated fear in the back of the minds of a lot of students that they won't get in any colleges. And I've seen this over and over. And so when I'm working with students, I like to have them apply to a school, either rolling admissions, early action. And we're going to talk more about that in later part of this podcast. If you're not sure what those are, we'll define them. But I like to have students do that and get in and get an early admission. And a lot of times when you do that, they're just like, big sigh, like, at least I know I'm going to college. And the first, 5-7 times I heard someone say, I'm like, what do you mean? At least you're going to college? Because of course, to me, it's obvious you are. But literally, people are afraid of that. And why is that? It's because all the frenzy in college admissions, all the press is around how Prestige U had their lowest acceptance rate this year. And that's what sells the magazines. That's what sells the books. That's what sells the newspapers. That's what generates the clickbait on the websites. So you'll see article after article, story after story of how much harder it is to get into college. And here's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
There are over 4,000 2- and 4-year colleges. There are over 3,000 4-year colleges. And while it is true that a portion of colleges have gotten substantially harder to get into, in the last several decades, it is a small percentage. It's like the 15% of the colleges that have gotten really, really hard to get in. But the other 85%, that's just not the case. They're looking for average kids who are well-behaved and love to learn. And that's fine. So here's some data. The average acceptance rate for all colleges is 67%. So basically 2/3 of people are getting in, as opposed to 1/3 not being denied or being denied. As you mentioned, Anika, there are a lot of open admission schools, meaning if you have a GED, you have, a diploma, you will be admitted. Test scores.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's talk about test scores, because people, my scores are so low. Well, the national average on the ACT is a 20.9. The national average for the evidence-based reading and writing portion of the SAT is a 533, and the math is a 527, making a 1060 the average for the SAT. But typically, if I'm working with a student and their scores are around there, they'll be like, oh, my scores are terrible. No, they're not. That's just right where the average person is. And, Anika, you were talking about scholarships for C students. You know who one C student was? David Letterman. David Letterman graduated. No, he was. He graduated from Ball State in 1969. He was a C student. So ever since 1982, so we're going back a ways now. This is more than 35 years. He has had a scholarship for the average student. Now, they have to show some creativity. He wants to see creativity, but a student with average grades to go to his alma mater, Ball State. But I like to share that story because obviously he went on to have a productive career. And so if he would have been like, woe is me, I'm a C student, there's no hope for me, he would have never accomplished the things that he does. So let me ask you this, Anika. Why do you think that perception is out there that, like, there's not going to be any options for me if I'm really kind of that middling, kind of just sort of average in the middle of the road kid?
Right. Because I think you hit the nail on the head earlier in that, it's these marketing from these schools, these very few, this small percentage of schools that is out in the mainstream media is that, okay, if you're at this level, then you're the person that belongs here. Or I probably didn't describe that as I wanted to.
Well, here's what I would say. I would say that's part of it, but it's even more the media. It's definitely true the school. I mean, you're actually, it's both and, right? So if you go to an information session, schools really, and for those of you who may not be familiar with that, when you visit a school, you go on a tour, you can also sign up for an information session. All right. It's like usually 30 minutes to an hour, and it's an overview PowerPoint presentation before you go on a walking tour. And so when you go on them, they have a real tendency to make themselves sound a lot more selective than they are.
Right.
Because they know that the more they can make their school sound hard to get into, scarcity sells, and then people will feel they'll value that in covet an admission acceptance versus if they get up there and say, we admit almost every student that applies. Like then people will say, oh, I don't want to go here. There's no, there's no prestige.
Right.
So you're absolutely right about the school, but there's another big portion, which is the media. This last year, Stanford denied more than 70% of kids that had perfect scores and perfect GPAs for all 4 years. That gets clicks. That gets buzz.
Right.
Now, who's going to read more art? Are you going to read that, or are you going to read generic you? It accepted 90% of kids this year. Like people don't really want to read that.
And so, Mark, what about the peers though in the schools? Because you think about it, I think about the last few high school graduations I went to, and the valedictorians and the kids up on the stage that are getting called for everything. They're normally it's often coupled with the more selective schools that they're deciding to attend. So it's kind of like that. I feel like it's that kind of culture of just it's perception, I guess. And the school
you know
itself.
what, Anika? You're actually bringing up another really good point, which is high schools tend to brag on the kids that get all those awards because they like to send the message.
Exactly.
Look what our product produces. So it's not just the colleges, it's not just the media, it's the high schools and who gets paraded around and who and who is interviewed for the newspaper and who the feature speaker is, and they like to get in. So so-and-so student had this GPA, had this. One of the things I laugh at is sometimes when I visit and I go to these graduations, they'll talk about 2 or 3 kids that got a perfect score on their SAT or their ACT, and in the context it's kind of like it's partly celebrating the student, but it's also saying, look at what our amazing education produced, and meanwhile the kid would have probably got the same score if they went to the school across the street, FYI. But but it's just part of the culture we want to ramp down. Now, I will say this, Anika, a lot of times, even on our podcast, like this section of our podcast, we're doing 65 straight episodes talking about how to get in. And as we get into the intricacies of how to get in, a lot of time we are talking about things that are the more selective, the more selective schools provide and offer or used to distinguish and differentiate. And a lot of our listeners, you value education. And because you value education, you emphasize it at home. And so in general, this is based on correspondence, we get by email. I would say the majority of our listeners tend to have kids above average, more so than at average. Obviously, there's exceptions. And so we will cater a lot as well to helping you differentiate the different nuances of what it takes to get in and not get into highly selective. So we are going to cover that, but we do not want to, in doing that, give you the impression that there's no hope for your child if they're not that kid.
That's right. And that's even more reason why y'all got to send these questions in. I mean, we have gotten some phenomenal questions and comments and responses and, from across the country, Mark. And I tell you, whatever your background is, whatever your current grade level is, send in your questions. This is all about all of you. So we highly encourage you to remember that. Please remember those words that Mark said.
And also, just to throw something else in, our email is questions@yourcollegebounkid.com. This week was a great week. Like, we really heard from a number of first timers who we hadn't heard from before. We have our regulars, and we love hearing from our regulars. We even have regulars who give us feedback, which is great. Like, I really like this about this episode, or might want to do this more. And that's how we improve. But we heard from a number of first timers this week. And even if it's not a question, drop us a line. It really, really encourages us.
That's right.
It's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right. Our question is from another awesome student. And this is Mr. Alex. He is a 12th grader in New York. And Mark, Alex needs to know if there are any advantages to applying to college through early action or early decision.
And You may remember last week, Nika, I said that was my second most asked question last week.
Mm-hmm,
The only question I got asked more in the whole week was, why am I getting all these mailers? And it was, I had that question asked 3 times again this week. So I know this is on a lot of people's minds. So let's first start with some basic definitions. Okay. There are, people oftentimes confuse early action versus early decision. First thing I want to say is, remember before I mentioned there are 3,000 four-year colleges, the majority of schools do not offer early action or early decision. In fact, under 300 schools offer it. So this is something that less than 10% of schools offer. It tends to be, in general, more selective schools, more private than public, but a decent number of public offer it, and the public portion are growing. So that's true for both early action or early decision. Now, let's start with early action. In the case of early action, you have an early deadline, okay? Meaning that there's a clear-cut deadline when you need to get your application in, and the deadlines usually range from October 15th all the way through to, well, and what we call the early round, November 15th is pretty common. That's usually somewhere in there, October 15th, November 1st, or November 15th. And when you apply early, you will be notified early, whether or not you are admitted. And notifications can occur before Christmas or in some cases before January 15th. But you do not have to attend. So you're notified that you got in. Let's say you get it December 15th, and you can still shop around. You can still visit other schools, add schools to your list, compare financial aid offers, and you have up until May 1st. That is early action. Now, there are a couple other variations of early action. There is some schools, even a smaller number of schools, have a second round of early action. And the second round of early action, all that means is there's a different date for your deadline and a different date for your notification. So maybe it's January 1st is your deadline and February 1st is your notification. But the same thing, you can shop around, you can compare aid offers, you can add new schools, you can research schools more. And then there's a third thing, which is called single choice early action, sometimes called restrictive early action. Very, very, very short list. Count them on one hand. 5 schools offer this. And in that case, you can apply early. You're notified early. You still can compare other schools all the way up until May 1st, but you can only apply early to one school, hence the name single choice or restrictive early action. I was planning to go into how rolling admissions differs from early action because rolling admissions also involves finding out early if you're getting admitted. But I think it may be information overload for one segment for us to add rolling admissions into the discussion here. So if you're interested, we had a deep discussion on how rolling admissions is similar in many ways, but also different in other ways from early action on episode 4, where we discussed this for about 10 minutes. So I encourage you to listen to episode 4 if you're interested. That's early action. Now, early decision, early deadline to get your application, early notification, but it's binding, meaning you're obligated and you're committed to go. And it's a serious commitment. The counselor has to sign and say you're committing early, the parent and you. And so those are the basic differences. And with early decisions, often called ED for short, and there's oftentimes a second round of ED known as ED2, early decision 2. And so those are the primary differences between early action and early decision. The question is, and I'm going to ask you this, Anika, are there benefits? Because I felt we needed to define it first, but are there benefits to applying early action or early decision? And are there drawbacks?
Well, I'm going to say, Jalen did the early decision 2 for Davidson. And he applied, the other schools that were on his list. It was the one school that he thought he was going to go to since he was a young chap back in the day.
You showed that you were 40-something with chap. I haven't heard that word in eons. You going British on me?
Well, hear it now. Well, my young chapper, he was all but told that if he didn't apply early decision to one of his schools, he basically didn't have a chance of coming in. Like they basically told him in so many words, if you want to come, we got you, but you got to let us know that you're coming. And so that was tough because, it was more so tough because he actually visited and did all that stuff, even though he had known about it for all these years and years and years. And he just thought that was going to be the place that he was going to, do all these great things. And he did not like the school when he went to visit.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the difference, is that what, to your point, is binding. So the advantage is, okay, it's like they pay more attention. Well, I shouldn't say pay more attention. It's a commitment between each other, essentially. You know, as you love me, I love you. We're in this together, right?
So you summarize really, really effectively, actually, the advantages and drawbacks of early decision. One of the advantages of early decision is that you do have an increased acceptance rate. No question about it. Look at all the statistics. They're published. I actually met with 2 different students this weekend that are looking at the University of Pennsylvania. 22% acceptance rate in the early round, 7% in the regular round. So better than a triple, you know, am I saying this right? Better than 300% chance, I guess, of getting in. and that's not uncommon. I could give you similar numbers to Vanderbilt, for Columbia. We could keep going down the line. You know what? I'm going to share some other schools so you can see the difference between the early decision admit rates and the regular admit rates. This is 2017 data. Middlebury College, 42% acceptance, early decision, 11 regular. Vassar, 42% early, 22 regular. Williams, 35% early, 13 regular. Northwestern University, 27% early, 7% regular. American University, a whopping 85% early versus 27 regular. Johns Hopkins University, 30% early, 8% regular. And just this weekend, I was listening to Johns Hopkins speak, and they said, hey, you want to show us you're serious about us? Apply early. And lastly, Lehigh, 60% early, 22% regular. Right? So increased chance of getting in, positive. Another positive is if you do get in, it can make the senior year less stressful because you can know where you're going in by December. Like Karis actually applied ED1 to Davidson, was in by December 15th, and she just loved life her whole senior year when her friends were tripping out. A third advantage is that if you know where you are going to school in December, you can start to plan and you can mentally get yourself in the space of transitioning to where your new home will be 4 months earlier than your peers. So that's some of the advantages of it. There are drawbacks. You know, one drawback is if money is a factor, you're unable to compare financial aid offers. So you have to be really sure that you're comfortable with what a school is going to charge. So that can be a drawback. Another potential drawback can be that if you haven't researched the school well enough and you're committing and you don't know that school well enough, then you're committing to a school that you may not have discerned whether or not it's a match for you. And then another potential drawback can be the fact that if you do get that bad news, Christmas can be kind of rough if you're fixating on it. I try to train people not to fixate on one school, but it's easier said than done. So that's kind of some of the pros and the cons of early decision. Now, early action, it's interesting because this is where I'm starting to see a change, Anika. Early action, it used to be, well, it's beneficial to you because it's like have your cake and eat it too. Get in early, but you don't have to go. You're not obligated. And in the past, we didn't really see differences between admission rates for students who apply early action and regular. Remember, there's also regular admissions as well. Like with regular, you've got a date, oftentimes January, February, some state and less selective schools they can get into the spring. And instead of finding out early, you find out, when the schools release the decisions. So there's no early notification. And so there never used to be sort of an admission advantage to applying early action like there was to applying an early decision. But increasingly, I'm seeing that. And it's very clear that schools that offer early action, because it's getting so competitive out there, increasingly what they're saying is, listen, we provided a way for you to apply early. It wasn't even binding, so you didn't even have to go. So if you chose not to do that, then you're kind of telling us a message that we're kind of an afterthought. And so I'm starting to really notice differences between higher acceptance rates in early action compared to regular, but nowhere near like early decision, because there are just so many advantages to the institution if they can lock people in and not have to compete. And plus, go ahead.
So speaking of that, Mark, I don't mean to cut you off, but so what is the advantage to the institution for early action? I don't get it.
Yeah.
Like, why are they doing early action?
Well, there's a lot of advantages. For one, it partly signals to them who's interested. Okay. Because if you have been thinking about them and planning for them, then you get your application in versus just an add-on at the last second. And so it is a partial signal to schools who's interested. Another major advantage to the school is that it allows them to spread out their reading over the whole reading season. So what happens is when you apply regular, most people are going to wait up until the deadline before they apply, right? And so it's a lot harder on your staff.
Right.
Let's say you have an early action deadline of November 1st, and then you have a regular decision deadline of January 15th. Well, now the applications are going to tend to come in around January 10th to January 15th. That's just the way that it is. And that's extremely hard on the staff to do all the reading and committee assignments and do all the reading. So it's a lot easier for the schools to disseminate that or to spread out that reading over the course of more months. Plus there's another one. So let's say it's a school. Let's say it's got a November 1 early action deadline, Anika. And let's say you're notified, let's just say December 15th that you're in. Okay. Well, let's say it really was your first choice and you don't feel you need to compare. Some of those people are going to say, you know what, this is my top choice. I'm going to go ahead and deposit now, meaning I'm going to sign the contract and submit. And so that's going to help the school tremendously too, because they're going to get more students who enroll earlier and then they can start planning around that.
Got it.
And actually schools can actually look at who they got in the early round, and that lets them know what they need more of in the regular round. So for example, let's say in the early round, they find out, oh, gee, we did really, really well in the Midwest. We did really well. Then it may be a little bit more competitive in the regular round because they're going to use the regular round to shape out the class in different ways than, they want a balanced class, right? So that could be anything. I mean, we could break that down. I just did it geographically, right? I could say that by majors. I could say that by race and ethnicity. I could say that by athletes and artists. I could say that by alumni, like all these different areas that the schools, international students, where they're trying to be balanced, they can use the regular round to fill in the holes of kids they didn't get in the early round.
So much science and strategy. You admissions folks got some work cut out for you.
Well, yeah. And on top of that, there's more schools out there than there are students. So the students usually have the leverage, which is what makes early decisions so powerful to schools.
Yeah.
Right. So they would say, many studies have been done that have shown that it's worth the equivalent of 100 SAT points to apply early decision. Because, hey, if a school can lock in a kid early and not have to compete, and that's why athletics is the same thing. Athletes, they want you to commit because those coaches get fired if you don't win. And so they don't want to have to wait really, really late and find out that they don't have anybody to play shortstop on the baseball team.
Well, listen, Alex, don't you go applying for that early decision now. If you didn't research those schools, you just keep that in the back of your little young mind. Okay.
Listening family, you are in for a treat. Michael Runowitz is in demand nationally as a speaker on financial aid. Great guy. And, I reached out to him about doing this interview on common mistakes students make on the Fafsa. And he did something which I loved. He reached out to his entire staff at WashU, got input from everybody, and you're going to hear a great list of mistakes. And I encourage all of you to listen to this week and next week before you fill that Fafsa form out.
And now, this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, we have a real financial pro with us today. We have Michael Runowitz, the Director of Financial Aid at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Mike.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Going to let Mike give a little bit of an introduction about himself and how he got involved in financial aid. But before you do that, Mike, I have to tell our listeners how I met Mike. So WashU has an amazing fly-in program where they fly in counselors from all around the world. And I was being flown in as one of their counselors. It was like 70 of us. And Mike did a session for the 70 counselors. And I was just really impressed with him, his knowledge, his approachability and friendliness. And so in the back of my mind, I thought, he's going to be a guy I'm going to reach out to because I knew I was writing a book. And at that time, I wasn't thinking about the podcast. But that's kind of how Mike first got on my radar. So you never know how life takes its twists and turns, Mike. And here you are on the Your College Bound Kid podcast.
Coming full circle here, Mark.
Yeah, great. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, including how you got involved in financial aid?
Sure. So I've been at Washington University in St. Louis here, as well as in financial aid since 2004. So my background prior to getting into financial aid was on the corporate side of things. My role had always been I was the person that understood both numbers and understood what the people that were out talking to customers needed to understand. So my role had always been supporting the sales or the customer service staff through a financial model. And in 2004, I was looking to relocate to St. Louis, and this opportunity at Washington University came up. And I had never really thought about financial assistance before, but it really fit into what I was passionate about. I was passionate about equity, and I was passionate about helping students overcome adversity and helping families overcome adversity. So I came here, I joined WashU in 2004 as Assistant Director of Student Financial Services. And then in 2012, I became the director here at WashU and have been doing and passionate about financial aid ever since.
And I just love your commitment to equity and access and overcoming barriers. And our regular listeners know that once we identify a thought leader in the industry, I like to ask, the thought leaders, what are your passions? And when Mike and I had that conversation, he said, I'd like to talk about something about access. So he said, give me a little time to think about it. And then I was delighted when we agreed to talk about what our subject of the day is. And that is, what are the common mistakes that students make on the Fafsa? So we've identified 16 common mistakes. And Mike was great enough not only to give his input, but to involve his staff, financial aid staff. So Mike, let's kick it off. The first one we've come up with is missing FAFSA and school deadlines. Anything you want to share in regard to that?
Absolutely. So for the FAFSA, the federal government sets a deadline, and the deadline is generally June 30th following the school year that just happened. Well, as you can imagine, completing your financial assistance application after your school year has already completed is probably not the best idea for families. So different schools and different states also have deadlines. So each state is going to set a priority deadline for the FAFSA. So for example, here in Missouri, the priority deadline for completing a FAFSA is February 1st. And if we're thinking about students entering college, that's February 1st of a student's senior year is the priority deadline for Missouri. But the other deadline that students really have to think about are school deadlines. And are the particular schools that students are interested, do they have their own deadlines? And if they do, it's really important that you hit those deadlines. Because the FAFSA, while we think of the FAFSA as the gateway to federal student aid, the reality is many schools use the FAFSA to also award institutional funds or to also allocate some of those federal dollars. So making sure that you get your FAFSA into the school by the date that they are requesting it is really important for students to do as well.
That's great. And Mike, have you noticed at all with the FAFSA changing back in 2016, going to what we call prior year, or sometimes early FAFSA, where you're submitting tax years for the year before? Have you seen any deadlines move up from anybody?
As you alluded, the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st of students' senior years now. And we have seen some schools move deadlines earlier in the process. At WashU, we've left our deadline at February 1st because we don't really need the information any sooner. But some schools, because the information is available sooner, have asked students to get that FAFSA in a little bit earlier. One of the benefits of the early FAFSA or the prior year FAFSA is that when a student is starting college in August after their senior year, the income that is going to drive that first year financial assistance award is based on 2 years prior. So virtually all of us, by the time a student starts, has completed their tax return from 2 years prior. So it really is a big benefit to students. At this point, schools haven't really moved up their deadlines in a big way. What we did do at WashU is for our returning students, so providing assistance to entering students is one part of the equation. But then, of course, students need the resources to continue to graduate and hopefully graduate on time. At WashU, we've started renewing student financial assistance awards as early as December in a student's year. So even before a student starts their second semester, we've renewed their financial assistance award. And we think that that's good for students because it gives students a little bit longer to understand what their financial assistance award for the upcoming year is, but also to ask any questions or to ask us to reevaluate things while a student is still here for the spring semester, rather than students having to think about this over the summer.
Well, keep being an emissary to your fellow financial aid colleagues at other institutions, because that would be fantastic if every school was doing that for renewals, because I see some very, very late renewal notices that go out.
But I will do my best.
So let's talk about the second mistake we've identified, which is confusing parent income and parent assets with student income and student assets. What do you want to share in regard to this, Mike?
So one of the things about the Fafsa is oftentimes students don't know the intricate details of a family's financial situation. Students might not know exactly how much money their parents make or how much money is in savings. And it's oftentimes the parents who are helping a student complete the Fafsa. And to be frank, many times it's the parent who's completing the Fafsa for the student. And as you're completing the Fafsa, since it's a student's Fafsa, the FAFSA's voice is talking directly to the student. So for example, it might say, how much money did you earn in 2016? And as a parent, when you read that, you think that they're talking to you, the parent. So parents sometimes say, how much money did you earn? Well, the parent will fill out what they as a parent earned, when in fact the FAFSA was really talking to the student. And that can happen not only on income and asset questions, but one of the places that also happens is how many students in your household will be in college in the upcoming year. And parents sometimes interpret that to mean, well, I'm going to be in college, I'm going to take some classes. That's not the question the FAFSA is asking. The question is asking about the student and the student's sibling, not about the parent in that case.
Yeah, and a lot of times, most people probably don't know this, but the FAFSA is looking at income and assets when it comes up with a expected family contribution, and money and assets in the student's name is treated differently than money and assets in the parent's name. Anything you want to share on that, Mike?
You're 100% right, Mark, and the difference is dramatic, and it's especially dramatic on the asset side. So as an example, an asset that we see in a parent's name, we would assume that about 5 to 6% of that asset would be available to be used to pay for college. If that same asset were in a student's name, colleges will assume that 20 to 25% of that asset can be used for college. So if we're talking about $100,000 of assets, that could be a $15,000 difference in financial aid eligibility just by making that very small mistake.
What a great example. Yeah. So the third one you've kind of alluded to, but let's talk about it still some more. And this is the student and the parent/guardian not being involved in the FAFSA completion. What do you want to share on this one?
So the reason that it's valuable for the student and the parent or guardian to complete the FAFSA is because not only does the student oftentimes not know what the parent's information is, but the FAFSA requires an electronic signature by both the student and the FAFSA. And the way that a family, a student, and a parent provide that electronic signature is by entering their federal student aid ID at the time that a student is submitting that FAFSA. And you need the parent in order to attest to the accuracy of that FAFSA electronically.
Great. The fourth one we've identified is if a student applies to more than 10 schools and they don't add the additional schools back into the FAFSA. So you want to talk about limits to the number of schools you can add into the electronic FAFSA and what a student needs to do, student/parent needs to do if they're applying to 12 schools or 13 schools. Why don't you comment on this one for us?
So as you said, students can submit their FAFSA information to up to 10 schools at a time. So if a student is applying to more than 10 schools, the way that a student would do that is the student would identify 10 schools, and would submit the FAFSA information to those schools. So they would submit the FAFSA, including the schools, those first 10 schools. Then after, and it's got to be after the student has received the confirmation that their FAFSA has been processed, the student can then log back into their FAFSA, act as if they're making corrections to their FAFSA because they are updating their FAFSA. And then what they would do is they would remove 2 of the 10 schools and then add the 2 additional schools in an example where a student were applying to 12 schools. It's really important that students remember to do this. And I would highly recommend that as students are shrinking their list of schools, drop the list of schools that FAFSA information is going to, because students aren't going to have 12 schools on their list until the very end. They might have 12 schools on their list throughout a portion of the process, but as that list is reduced, take those schools off of your FAFSA.
Thank you. And the fifth mistake we feel is not using the online FAFSA. You want to talk about the online versus the paper FAFSA and the differences and some of the advantages to the online FAFSA, Mike?
Absolutely. This year, over 99% of all FAFSAs were submitted online. I would highly encourage everyone to use the online FAFSA for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a lot more difficult to make mistakes. And the reason is the FAFSA online has some built-in controls so that if you're giving an answer that clearly looks to be wrong, you will get an error message that says, you just said that you made $0. Is that really accurate? And having that as an aid is really valuable to students. The other reason that online is much better than paper when it comes to the FAFSA is if you make a mistake or you have to make a correction or an update, it is much, much easier and much, much faster to make that correction online. You can log back in, you make your correction, it gets sent back to the school, and then everybody's got the correct information. On paper, you've got to put it in the mail, send it to the Department of Ed, and then the Department of Ed, once they process it, sends it to the school.
Yeah, so you even hit on another reason there, which is the faster turnaround time, the paper versus the online. And I don't know if this is still the case, but the last time I checked, the 10 schools that you can include only applied to online. The paper FAFSA, I thought it was 4, but it wasn't as many. And so that would even be another reason there.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
The recommended resource for week 34 is the website bigfuture.org. This is one of the first websites I go to when I want to research a college. After using the search feature to find the college you're looking for, click all 6 tabs on the left side of the page. I'm referring to the At a Glance tab, the Deadlines tab, Majors and Learning tab, Campus Life tab, Applying tab, and the Paying tab. They really have some short, helpful videos as well on this site. They have a place to explore careers. They have a place to help you put a plan together. And I absolutely love their financial aid by the number section, where you can graphically do a deep dive into how each college gives their money away, looking at merit aid, loan aid, amount of debt, and many, many, many other features. The website is colorful, aesthetically pleasing, and user-friendly. It is a product of the College Board, the same people who administer the SAT and AP exams. We will now return to my interview with Michael Runowitz. The next reason, number 6, and this one I had a decent amount of experience. I feel like I still have a migraine from this year from dealing with this one this year, is putting the wrong Social Security number on the FAFSA. Any stories at all that you can share or any experience with this one, Mike?
Well, absolutely. The reason that this happens, or one of the causes of this, is parents completing the FAFSA, as we talked about earlier, and parents oftentimes either misremember students' Social Security numbers, or they accidentally use a different child's Social Security number for the child that's going to be in college. The other thing that we often see is students are using their Social Security number, and they often don't use their Social Security number. So this is one of the real first opportunities that students have to know that number, and it's easy to make a mistake. Once a mistake is made, it can be really challenging to get that corrected, because the Social Security number serves as what's called the key for the student's FAFSA. And when you go to change a Social Security number, it becomes a lot more complicated and oftentimes requires the assistance of either a financial aid administrator like me or somebody from the Department of Ed.
Yeah, the one situation I had this year, the aunt did it with the student and then messed up the social security number, and then all kinds of correspondence from the school going back and forth saying we don't have your FAFSA. It really took a long time to just get that whole thing straightened out. So I can definitely attest to that. The seventh one is kind of different, but it's still what we would regard as a mistake. Assuming that you do not qualify for any money and therefore not completing the FAFSA at all. What do you want to say about this one, Mike?
Well, I have dozens of conversations a year that start off in a similar way. And the conversations start off with, I was talking to my coworker, or I was talking to the Uber driver, or I was talking to the dry cleaner or my neighbor about financial aid, and he or she said this. And can you tell me if that's true? What I always tell those families is start with the expert. Don't start with your neighbor or your friend when it comes to whether or not financial aid is a possibility for you. So financial aid, not only is it based on the information that you provide on your FAFSA, it's also based on the cost of the school you're attending. So oftentimes a family that might not qualify for financial aid at a state institution or a community college, for example, might qualify for even significant amounts of aid at a private, more expensive school, for example. So just because your neighbor or your friend that makes a similar amount of money as you do didn't qualify for financial assistance, that doesn't mean that that same thing is going to apply to you. It's much better to apply for aid and not receive it than to fail to apply and really need it.
It might be helpful, Mike, for people to understand sort of the basic financial aid formula. And do you want to kind of share that? Because I think they'll see why that makes sense, what you said, that a school that, say, has a $70,000 cost of attendance compared to one that has a $25,000 one, are going to be different in regard to that.
Absolutely. So the formula for financial aid, I almost have to laugh when I say it's pretty simple because there's a lot of complicated math on the backside of it. But the formula ultimately is a school's cost of attendance. And when we talk about cost of attendance, tuition fees, room, board, books, personal and miscellaneous, travel, all of those things are included in cost. So cost of attendance minus a family's expected family contribution, which is directly derived from the FAFSA, equals a student's eligibility for need. So cost minus expected family contribution equals need. So that's why a higher cost school might allow a student to qualify for more financial assistance.
That was excellent. I think you absolutely nailed it there. The eighth mistake we've identified is when a student or even a parent is ever doing it, when they list their primary residence, their home, in the asset section. What can you say about this, Mike?
So the first thing I'd like to say about this is the value or the equity a family has in its primary residence is never, ever required on the FAFSA. But sometimes families feel like that it should be required or it should be reported. And the reason that happens is the FAFSA wants to know about other real estate investments that a family has. So families might read the word real estate and think, well, my house is real estate. Well, that's true, but the house is specifically excluded from the FAFSA. The other reason that I hear people making mistakes is, in addition to the FAFSA, some schools require additional financial aid applications. And sometimes on those additional forms, schools do want to know about the equity that a family has in its home. And sometimes families don't realize the FAFSA is not one of those forms that requires that information.
Yeah, that was really helpful. And our ninth mistake is it's kind of in the same vein, which is including your retirement in assets. What can you share about this? And have you experienced? Is this one of these things you experience every year or every 5 years? What would you say about this one?
So any asset that's in a defined retirement plan, and what defined retirement plan means is defined by the Internal Revenue Service. So we're talking about IRAs, 401ks, things like that. Anytime you've got an asset in that plan, it does not have to be reported on the FAFSA. Retirement assets are never reported on the FAFSA. The reason that people make this mistake is one of the questions on the FAFSA wants to know how much money did your family put into retirement in 2016, for example? So families see that the FAFSA is asking about how much money did I put into retirement? Well, it makes sense to families that I should probably include my retirement assets as well. They're specifically excluded. And this is one of the most common mistakes that we experience. And you asked if I hear about this every year or every 5 years. I hear about this dozens of times every single year. And I mentioned that 5 to 6% of assets in a parent's name are considered available to pay for college. So let's say, Mark, you've got $500,000 saved in your retirement account. That's going to cause a huge reduction in your financial aid eligibility if you accidentally report that.
Yeah, and think if you make the same mistake also with your home,
Exactly.
I mean, you're going to turn around and not be eligible for any need-based aid when you could maybe be someone who might qualify for a lot of need-based aid. So,
That's right.
These are not $5, $10, $100, even $1,000 mistakes. Some of these mistakes we're talking about here.
And it's a lot easier, Mark. It's a lot easier to get financial aid awards correct out the door. So when a school is providing a financial assistance award, you want their best financial assistance award right out the door. It's a lot more difficult to get schools to reevaluate and increase a financial assistance award because when students are generally doing that, all the other students that have problems and concerns are also calling the financial aid office. So the resources are getting squeezed at the same time that families are needing the most support. So making sure that you avoid these mistakes is a real positive.
Friends, next week, in part 2 of my interview with Mike Runowitz, Mike comments on 7 more common mistakes students make on the FAFSA. Mike shares the number 1 reason, the most frequent mistake students at WashU make on their FAFSA. And one of my former students, who is now an admission officer at Springfield College, asked me to mention the most common mistake Springfield College students make with their FAFSA submissions. And Mike comments on that mistake as well.
Next week in the news, student debt seems to be giving way to parent debt. And here's what you can do about it. And we'll be in chapter 35 of 171 answers. And we're talking about what grades colleges see in a student's senior year before they make their admissions decisions. And for next week's question, a mom wants to know if 2 parents who are divorced and living in different households, if they both can take out Parent Plus loans to help their child pay for college. And Mark wraps it up with Mr. Mike Runowitz in part 2 and the final part of the common mistakes made on the FAFSA application. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. And if you find this podcast helpful, it would help us tremendously if you would subscribe and write us a review on your favorite podcast listening station. And please be sure to click the share button and send it to someone you know who could really use this information. The amazing music that you hear is by Victor Allen Weeks. Artwork is by Andrea Togo. Marketing designs are by Kimberly Blass. And Your College Bound Kid is produced by Esteban Sartho. If you want to get a copy of the book, 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, you can go right to 171answers.com. And if you would like to have a college coaching session with Mark, you can send him a text at area code 404-664-4340.
And if you have a question or a few questions that you would like for us to answer on each show, please email us at questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. That's questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Every week, we'll take one question and include it in the episode. We don't like your questions. We love your questions, so send them our way. And by the way, check out our website, which is just simply yourcollegeboundkid.com. Again, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to meeting with you again next week.